probably has the toughest political job in Canada, and it may be only a few short weeks ahead. That is Bob Skelly, the man who virtually admitted on page 1 of the Vancouver Sun that the charisma and charm of Van der Zalm will slaughter him in the next election.
Well, I'll tell you what we did on page 1 of the Sun, Jack. We said that charisma and charm isn't going to be the issue in the next election. The issue is going to be the hard questions that people are asking now, and that Mr. Van der Zalm isn't answering. Hard questions about jobs, hard questions about education, hard questions about the future of British Columbia that Mr. Van der Zalm is dodging right now.
But you
Not
know,
charm and charisma, but the hard issues.
You know as well as I do that since he swept onto the scene from Whistler, he has given all kinds of attractive promises, most of which he can deliver on, which will mean that he's going to be an unblemished premier if he calls an election, more or less, now and sweeps into office, ignoring the sins of omission of the old Bennett government.
It's like the 1930s all over again, a chicken in every pot. It's all the promises, the backslapping, the baby kissing. It's the old style of politics without substance that has caused us the problem in BC for so long. And I think people in BC right now aren't looking for that kind of backslapping, baby-kissing politician. They're looking for some solutions to problems, real solutions.
But is it not a fact, though, that your whole NDP campaign to fight Bennett had been bought, paid for, and prepared, and all of a sudden you have to switch all your directions when you've got very little money in the bank?
No question that the leadership of Social Credit has changed. We defeated the last leader without having an election. He resigned because he couldn't win the election. We now have a new leader. We have to take a new tack, but we want to stick to the issues in this election campaign as we did with Bill Bennett. The Jobs First strategy, the Youth Guarantee Program, equality for women, high-quality system of education in this province. All of the things that the people in BC are looking for, those are going to be the issues in the next campaign, regardless of the leader.
What you're telling me is that Van der Zalm is charming, got charisma, and no depth. What do you not like about Van der Zalm as a politician?
Well, there's nobody here that I don't like, Jack, but I don't like a politician that comes forward and that trades on personality without telling the people what he plans to do. We saw before the 1983 election campaign, Bill Bennett not promise the people anything, and then bring in, after that 1983 election, one of the most vicious restraint programs that's ever been imposed on any province in this country for years and years. We want to see the program that Mr. Van der Zalm has before he goes to an election campaign.
When, in your considered professional opinion, will he go to the election campaign?
Very hard to say. It's completely unpredictable, but I think he's taking the advice of his high-paid advisors within the Social Credit Party right now. I think that they're suggesting to him that he go as quickly as possible, that he go before Expo closes, and there's 200,000 people or more out of work in the province. So I think they're giving him advice to go as quickly as possible.
And if he goes quickly, how quickly can that be?
He has 28 days minimum between the time that he resigns and the time that the writs are returned. So about 28 days.
28 days. In other words, the second or third week in October would be the perfectly legal time to call and deliver a campaign.
Yep, it's feasible.
They have started the nominations pretty broadly, especially in those places. If it's a general election, there'll be a number of new two-member ridings, correct?
Right.
Are you ready to go?
We have nominated, I asked our party during the last convention in May of 1985, I asked our party to nominate candidates in every constituency, to set up election planning committees in those constituencies, and I asked them at the same time to try to achieve the level of 50% women candidates. And up to now, we have all but 5 or 6 candidates nominated. So we're ready to go.
You're ready to go now?
We were ready to go this spring.
Any money in your campaign coffers?
Well, money is always a lot more difficult for us than it is for Social Credit. When you see how much money was spent on the Social Credit leadership campaign, in the space of about 60 days, they spent more money than we've spent in the last 2 election campaigns. So
how much did you spend on your leadership campaigns when you fought against the other leadership?
I was limited to $20,000 for a year-long campaign, and so were all the other leadership candidates.
Mr. Van der Zalm only spent $150,000 in a matter of a month or less, did he not?
I haven't spent that in my 14-year political career.
Now, Mr. Skelly, let's get down to some issues. You will give me the usual NDP pie in the sky, that you can correct the abominable unemployment and deprivation in British Columbia in a mere short one session.
No, in fact, Mr. Van der Zalm is the one who's promising the overnight cures, but he's not being very specific about anything. We have said that we will embark on a program to get people back to work in this province, get them back to work, earning incomes with money in their pockets. They can contribute in a positive way to the economy. We estimate that we can get a lot of people back to work in this province through a number of concrete programs.
What is the provincial current deficit on borrowings for operations at the moment?
Accumulated deficit, that's money that we've borrowed or that the social credit government has borrowed to run their day-to-day operations, is $5.1 billion. And the deficit this year alone is $875 million. But that's before we hear the results. That's unaudited. Those are projected deficits.
But the fact remains that the only way that you could create jobs in British Columbia is by direct borrowing for some form of public works.
No. That's what we are talking about is reprioritizing the expenditures of the current government.
Just a minute, don't use that word. Reprioritizing.
Okay. Instead of spending money on wasteful programs
Such as?
that don't deliver jobs, I've mentioned paying off the historic debt of BC Rail 20 years before it's due. They spent $430 million on that a few years ago. I've said that the $100 million stock assistance program that they bought to help people buy shares on the Vancouver Stock Exchange and then to insure them against losses.
But they didn't implement that.
They haven't implemented that. They should be spending that $100 million on employment generation programs.
Would you rate, carry on.
The $20 million that they're spending on government information services, advertising the Social Credit Party with taxpayers' funds, we'd certainly reprioritize that money and put it into job creation programs so that all the people in the province could benefit instead of the SOCREDs benefiting politically from that taxpayers' expense.
But you would do the same thing in power.
No, I've said we won't. I've said we won't do that kind of advertising. It's a blatant disregard for the expenditure of taxpayers' money for political purposes. That money should not be spent for political purposes.
I don't want to paint you as a party of doom and gloom, but how bad is the situation affecting people in British Columbia?
Well, it is bad, and there's been a tremendous amount of hype, of course, this year to cover it up around Expo and around the Social Credit Leadership Convention. But there's 540,000 people in this province, 1 in every 5, who lives below the poverty line. 80,000 of those are children. There's 175,000 people who are out of work, unemployed. There are 120,000 people on welfare in this province, heads of families.
120,000?
Yep.
I thought it was 200,000.
No, I'm talking about heads of families.
Heads of families.
Right.
So therefore you can add up what poverty level are you using when you talk about 540,000 people at or below the poverty line?
That's using the Statistics Canada level.
So what's that, 12,000 or 16,000?
It varies from region to region because it's easier to live on a lower income in rural areas than it is downtown, for example.
So your answer is what? I didn't quite get it clearly. Reprioritizing a few $1 million of expenditures here and there.
Well, let me list the program, and I have done this before, but we've developed what we call the Jobs First Employment Strategy that gets people back to work in reforestation. That would require an expenditure of about $300 million in the first year.
Have we none of that going now?
Very little of it. Very little of that kind of expenditure.
How many
going into
jobs would that be in
reforestation.
the first year?
We estimate about 13,000 jobs a year for 5 years.
And what kind of wages? Minimum wage?
We absolutely refuse to pay people at the minimum wage in this province. At $3.65 or $3.65 an hour, Jack, we have the lowest minimum wage in Canada. And it's impossible to survive on that wage. So to put people to work at the minimum wage is really condemning them to poverty.
But even you can't blame the old Bennett government for all our ills and problems today. When you think of the collapse and the changes in the lumber trade without the strike and without the countervail, we were in bad shape before.
But all of those problems, the worldwide problems that you cannot influence, all of those things mean that the government locally has to pay a lot more attention to the domestic economy. We've been looking at the export economy, and that's something that we should promote and something that should grow. But we should also be looking at the domestic economy, small business, employment generation projects that keep people at work here in BC.
Again, even you, there's nothing you can do about the American attitude on the countervail or on the shake and shingle duty. That was not the fault of the BC government. That was the fault, if anyone, of Ottawa, was it not?
No, there isn't nothing you can do. The BC government can take a strong position with respect to the countervail, and we've supported the BC government in the past in presenting the case to the International Trade Administration in the United States, in attempting to convince U.S. politicians that they shouldn't be embarking on protectionist measures against our timber. So We've supported the government on that issue. We'd like to see the forest industry grow and thrive in this province.
More with Bob Skelly, leader of the NDP in British Columbia, after the break. Mr. Skelly, are you prepared to give Mr. Van der Zam credit for, one, the quick, slick BCGEU settlement?
Well, I'm prepared to give Mr. Bennett credit for that. I think what Mr. Bennett did is he left the options open to whoever the new leader might be, and I don't think Mr. Bennett chose Mr. Van der Zam. I think he was hoping it might be somebody else. But,
surely Bennett and Spector together were all set to hammer the BCU, and Van der Zam came in and said, cost another $50 million, give it.
That's right, but he left that option open for Van der Zam. So the BCGEU and the government were fairly close together.
And he okayed it once the extra money for the Cominco lead smelter, didn't he?
Bill Bennett okayed the Cominco smelter and purchased the
shares. Give Van der
shares.
Zam credit.
Well, Van der Zam has to do something before he gets credit for it, so we're waiting to see if Mr. Van der Zam does anything.
Took off the transit levy right away, April the 1st or something.
Did you do that in Victoria, or was it just in Vancouver?
I don't know.
I think he did it just in Vancouver.
No. The transit levy would come off all across the board. I know that for sure.
But that's fine. If he took the transit levy off, that's exactly what we were asking for. But we were also asking for some information about how he's going to finance this hugely expensive ALRT system that he bought in Ontario when he was minister responsible for transit. So we want to know how Mr. Van der Zam plans to finance this.
But in the meantime, he removed that annoyance to people on low income to pay the extra $5 a month.
He did that before the election. What's he going to do after the election? Because the bills are still going to be there to be paid.
Do you support his plan, if an area approves, to have government-supervised gambling casinos?
We don't think that there should be for-profit gambling in British Columbia. We think it attracts organized crime. It creates difficulties that make it very, very difficult for government to deal with. So we're against for-profit casinos.
You're against anything other than charity casinos for small amounts of money?
We believe in government-supervised lotteries and gambling for charity, for public purposes.
But not for profit?
But not for profit.
And there you part with Van der Zam, who seems to be prepared to go the bigger style if the community approves.
Well, I think Van der Zam is en route to getting this province in deep trouble if he goes for for-profit casino gambling. It's the same anywhere in the world where they have for-profit gambling. It creates difficulties in organized crime.
Mr. Van der Zam has made it quite clear that he's concerned about the abortion perhaps being used sometimes for birth control. Is that any of his business?
I think abortion is a matter of choice for the woman involved in consultation with the medical and spiritual advisors of her choice. I don't think that the Premier of the province should decide whether a woman can have an abortion or not.
He can express an opinion on it, and he, of course, is against abortion, generally speaking. He can't
Certainly
qualify that. But has he stuck his nose too far into the abortion question?
I think so. I think that he does not have a right as an individual to impose his personal beliefs on society as a whole.
Now, what about, he said to me yesterday that he would favor a possible experiment in one area whereby people were entitled to allocate the school taxes for the private school of their choice. Would you support that, either in an experiment or province-wide?
No, I don't think so. I think that the government has a responsibility to provide the highest quality public school system that they can possibly provide. Now, this government has become involved in the funding of private schools, and I think that funding method should be maintained. Rather than doing away with it, I think it should be maintained.
You mean a fairly small amount go to the independent schools?
A direct system of grants to independent schools, but going along with that system of grants, inspection by the province to make sure that private schools are providing a high-quality education system.
What conflict of interest rules, were there law, should Mr. Van der Zam be following on his garden interests? What should he do about that to please you, Bob Skelly?
It's not a question of pleasing me. It's a question of being seen to serve the public interest rather than his own personal business interests. I think what Mr. Van der Zam should have done prior to appointing his cabinet is that he should have brought down conflict of interest guidelines in very much the same way that David Peterson, the Premier of Ontario, did prior to appointing his cabinet. It should require full disclosure. It should require divestiture of interests that are in conflict with the public interest, and I think that there should be an ethics officer to review the holdings of ministers to make sure that there is no conflict.
And would you say that Mr. Van der Zalm, as long as he holds his connection with his garden operation in the ALR, albeit a little bit, is in conflict of interest?
I think it was a mistake for Mr. Van der Zalm to hold on to that property. I think it places him under the suggestion and the appearance of conflict of interest. I think it was an error for him to hold on to that property, and I think he should have brought down conflict of interest guidelines.
Now, of course, on the other hand, the average person in British Columbia probably says to himself, the man's a successful businessman. He had it before. Why not let him continue with his private business? What possible harm can it do? Because Van der Zalm, at least one thing, is open and talkative about his private affairs.
Well, that's true, but I think the public has to know that there is no conflict between his service to the public, which he elected to become involved in. There was no obligation on his part to become the leader of the Social Credit Party and the premier of the province. But Mr. Van der Zalm has to satisfy the public that he is serving their interests above his own private interest. And I think we want to bring down conflict of interest guidelines that don't keep business people out of politics. And I think it is possible to do, as they have done in other provinces and nationally, to develop those guidelines that allow business people to become involved in politics, but also to protect them from the accusations that they may be serving their own
And
interests.
he acted very quickly, giving Brian Smith the job of looking into the possible conflict of interest of Tom Waterland.
I think that was a mistake, because the Attorney General should not be investigating one of his own cabinet colleagues. You know what happens when that results, because we've seen a whole series of AG investigations in this province that have investigated their cabinet colleagues and come out with a clean bill of health, in my view, a whitewash. I think that what Mr. Van der Zalm should have done is to set up an independent inquiry, as was done in NDP Manitoba, as was done in NDP Ontario, as is being done with Sinclair Stevens nationally. We should see an independent inquiry into Mr. Waterland's activities, and I think we should do it with Don Phillips too.
Why with Don Phillips?
Because Don Phillips has taken a fee from 5 municipalities in the Peace River area to lobby the government to set up a pulp mill in that area, because he's taken a fee from the Dawson Creek municipality to lobby the government for an ethanol plant. Any conflict of interest legislation anywhere in Canada, in fact anywhere in North America, would bar Mr. Phillips from lobbying his former employees or his colleagues for a period of a year or 2 years or more.
Now, let me make that quite clear. That's an ethical offense more than anything else, isn't it? All these conflict offenses are not offenses against the code. They're ethical offenses. Am I correct?
That's right. They're not criminal offenses unless there is a clear suggestion of, or clear evidence of conflict of interest. But it should not be possible for a former minister to use his contacts in the government employ or in the ministry to feather his own nest and to enrich himself at the expense of his former constituents.
You're saying there should be the ban that we have in Ottawa, although it hasn't been very successful, whereby a former cabinet minister cannot do business with the government or his own department or whatever for a period, I think it is, of 2 specific years.
That's right. The ban is in Ottawa. It's also in the United States. The Canadian government got involved with Michael Deaver, as you recall, over the acid rain program. Mr. Deaver apparently violated the conflict of interest legislation in the United States, and it caused him embarrassment, it caused the Canadian government embarrassment, and in order to avoid that embarrassment, I think we should have strict conflict of interest guidelines.
I should know this offhand, but I don't know. What's the count in seats in the House just now?
21 NDP, I believe 35 Social Credit.
And we're going up by 12, correct?
And we're going up by 12 new seats.
Now, did I hear you say that you have given instructions that 50% of your candidates must be women?
I asked our party to use that as an objective, as a target. And as of today, 1/3 of our nominated candidates are women. So I think they've made a good effort. And in fact, I think we'll be putting forward the best team of candidates that's ever been put forward in any election campaign in this province during the coming provincial election.
So 21, 35, 56, 68. You'll be putting up a slate of about 30 men and 30 women.
No, we'll have 21 or 22 women in the next election campaign.
And you expect
Out of 69.
when do you expect that to be called?
Very hard to say. We expected an election as early as this spring. It could happen, we feel if it's going to happen this fall, it'll happen before the close of Expo.
Well, what do you think of my 2 first programs at 5 p.m.? Van der Zalm last night Skelly tonight, Webster here too. We're going to go to the phones. I have a few more questions, but we're going to go to the phones now to talk to Skelly and about BC politics after the break. Some more key questions to help you make up your mind. Mr. Van der Zam last night, Mr. Skelly, was very blunt on negotiating Indian land claims. He said, no, that's a matter for the federal government. What is your stand on negotiating Indian land claims, which now cover virtually all of the province of British Columbia?
Well, of course, Mr. Van der Zam's answer is a pat answer. The federal government is aware that even though they're responsible for Indians, that they do not have the jurisdiction over lands and resources in this province, so they cannot negotiate land settlements without the provincial government being involved. I think that the provincial settlement of land claims in the province of British Columbia is going to provide a tremendous economic opportunity and an economic boost to this province. Everybody who has observed the James Bay hydroelectric development in Quebec knows that more jobs were created as a result of the land settlement than were created as a result of the hydroelectric project. I think Mr. Van der Zam is ignoring a terrific economic opportunity by not negotiating settlements with the Indians so that we can get on the business of developing this province.
But Mr. Van der Zam is surely right when he says that the federal government must, in effect, negotiating, I'm taking it one step further, by supplying the monies involved, paying the cost of Indian land settlements. Is that not correct and accurate?
There's no question that that's a federal responsibility, that the federal government is responsible for Indians and lands reserved for Indians under our Constitution, so they must be responsible for the financial costs of the land settlement. The cost
so you would negotiate and Ottawa would pay?
Ottawa has to be at the negotiating table, the Indians have to be at the negotiating table, and in spite of what Mr. Van der Zam says, the provincial government has to be at the table. Look, if we allow the courts to settle this issue, I think it's going to be more damaging to the province than a negotiated settlement. So I would prefer to negotiate a settlement rather than leaving it up to the courts, when who knows what might happen as a result of a court decision.
There are 3 cases involving title, I believe, coming up in the courts within the next foreseeable period.
That's right.
You think that might make a very bad precedent and cost much more money than negotiating directly with the Indian bands?
Well, we don't know what kind of a decision the courts are going to come down with, but it may be a decision that the provincial government will not be able to live with. The courts may decide that the Indians own all of the province, and we may end up having to negotiate land back. I'm not sure that we want to be in that position.
Surely that's ludicrous.
In fact...
I mean, from the ordinary man in the pub's point of view, he tends to brush aside Indian lands claims as a piece of nonsense.
In fact, Jack, that the courts have warned the people of British Columbia along those lines themselves, and the federal government has warned the people of British Columbia that if the courts are involved, whatever settlement is arrived at may not be acceptable to any of the parties involved.
Question which I raised last night with Mr. Van der Zam. What is your opinion of the $25 million loan of U.S. money from BCDC, or from the government through BCDC, to the American firm Louisiana Pacific to build a wafer board plant which is badly, and jobs are badly needed, up in Dawson Creek?
Well, I think there's much better ways to obtain jobs in the South Peace River country, and one way is not to give Louisiana Pacific 3 times more money than they would have got in any state in the United States. So we were very generous in the money that we lent or gave to Louisiana Pacific. Also, I think it was done without concerning ourselves, or the Socreds did it without concerning themselves, as to where those jobs would be taken from. And we're concerned that as a result of this establishing the Louisiana Pacific plant near Dawson Creek, we may be taking jobs away from other parts of the province. You don't expand the economy by robbing jobs from elsewhere in the economy. What we should be doing is creating new jobs in South Peace and new jobs elsewhere.
Is that the kind of deal that an NDP government would make, give an American firm $25 million loan to be repaid without interest for the first 3 years and half prime for the second 3 years?
I think it's a ridiculous expenditure of the public money. I think we could have created far more jobs with that level of financing than this government has done with the Louisiana Pacific project.
Mr. Van der Zam told me last night that Site C is not down the tube, Site C being a Bill Bennett mega project for building another dam to export power to the United States. You must have a firm opinion on Site C. That would give many jobs to unemployed tradesmen, would it not?
Well, look, what Mr. Van der Zam said was pretty evasive. In fact, I thought all of his answers to your questions were pretty evasive. He said, we're going to build the Site C Dam if we can sell the power. Well, that's like saying I'm going to grow bananas if I can sell the bananas. Who knows whether they're going to build the dam or whether they're able to sell the power or not. What we're saying is that we should be developing sensible energy projects around the province. Projects that generate energy in every region of British Columbia, and projects that utilize the energy here, such as electrification of the national railroads and the provincial railroad in British Columbia. That would use energy right here in this province, put BC construction workers to work, and provide us with an assured supply of energy and fuel for our railway systems.
I want to give you a chance to gloat about the dreadful state of brick. What would you do with brick if you became Premier tomorrow? Down to $1.25, $6, $9, bad business, selling off the oil in the North Sea. You want to gloat about it? What would you do with it now? Take it back?
I'd hold on to it because I can't afford the commissions.
Now, Mr. Van der Zam kind of backed away from me on the privatization of liquor stores, but he had a good point. He said that in future, no new liquor stores really, but put them in private hands. Would that not be a good mix of the massive BC Liquor Board conglomerate and private enterprise?
I don't think I would go along with that policy at all. I would like to see the government liquor stores retained, and where expansion is necessary, that the expansion be done within the government service. However, I want to say this, Jack, that there are some good things that were done under the Bennett government, and that is that wineries were allowed to sell their produce either on the site of the winery or else set up special wine stores in communities such as Vancouver or Victoria. Cottage breweries were allowed to do the same thing. I think those things are good ideas to encourage the expansion of cottage wineries and breweries in the province. And
of course, one of your good ideas would be to stop the encroachment of non-union construction firms. Would you bring back the old NDP law, 72-75, that you had to be a unionized firm to bid for construction jobs on the highways and public works?
No, and the construction unions aren't asking for that. What they're asking for is a fair wage policy so that unionized construction firms can bid on a fair and competitive basis with non-union firms without wages being the determinant, because the non-union firms can always drive down wages and prevent the unionized construction firms from getting the
You
jobs.
therefore would implement the fair wage policy of the federal government, in effect, their fair wage policy, so that all people bidding for government construction had to bring in that higher minimum wage in their bids.
In fact, the Socreds put that legislation on the books back in 1976. We would develop a wage schedule under the fair wage legislation and put government work out to tender on a fair wage basis.
You know, people say that that you don't have the charisma of Van der Zam, but I don't think you're that bad. You are a school teacher after all, aren't you?
I have taught school for a year and a half.
How long have you been leader of the party now?
Since 1984, May of 1984.
People are astonished by the incredible pensions that come out of service in the legislature, aren't they? 57,000 indexed for life. You boys have certainly helped yourselves to good pensions, haven't you?
Well, as you know, Jack, we're not allowed to contribute to the Canada Pension Plan, so we're not entitled to some of the other pension plans that the general public are entitled to. I estimate that if I leave office now, I will get the equivalent of welfare for a family of 4.
Can you win the next election?
We can win the next election, but we'll do it on the issues that concern the people of British Columbia. Education, employment, health care, those issues that concern people of this province.
Your questions to Bob Skelly, leader of the NDP, after the break. You say you were doing well in the polls vis-a-vis Bennett, were you not?
Yes.
And your personal popularity, was it higher than Bill Bennett's?
I don't think we ever tested personal popularity, but no question that we were doing fairly well in the polls as long as Bennett was leader of the party.
But now since Van der Zam came in, 64% of the people polled recently, they said they would make Van der Zam would be the best premier regardless of party affiliation.
Well, if you're talking about the province poll, I don't think you should call it a poll. It was a write-in poll. It wasn't done on a random sample.
So that was no good. Go ahead to Bob Skelly.
Yes, good afternoon, gentlemen. Was watching that commercial that the Premier was in before the last set of commercials and wondering what the cost of that commercial would be. And my question is, do you think it would be valuable for the public in general if the cost of that commercial was perhaps broadcast and the fact that it is paid by the taxpayer?
Oh, it's a good point. I didn't see the commercial, and I wasn't aware that Mr. Van der Zam was making commercials, but I guess he's been acting quickly in that regard.
I didn't see it either.
The cost of the government information services, though, is about $15 million annually, and it's an extremely high cost when you compare advertising programs in other governments to advertising programs in BC. The program here is used to finance the Social Credit Party advertising, and I think it's a blatant violation of ethics.
Except almost everybody does it.
No, not everybody does it. This government does it far more than most other governments in Canada and elsewhere in the world.
We've just been brainwashed into accepting it. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Mr. Skelly.
Good morning.
Good
Afternoon.
morning. Good evening. When are you guys going to get on the campaign bandwagon? I used to be a real strong NDPer, and ever since you've taken over the reins, I just don't like what the party's leaning towards.
Well, why don't you give me a shout? We're going to be starting on the campaign bandwagon shortly. As you know, we don't have the resources that Social Credit obviously has as a result of the expenditures at their leadership convention. But we'll certainly be starting the campaign as soon as the election's called.
Thank you. I should really have asked people if they thought you'd make a good, who'd be the better Premier, you or Van der Zam. That's what I should have asked people. Well, it would be just as fair as any other one. Go ahead, please.
Jack, nice to have you back. Mr. Skelly, I'm
Hello.
sitting here listening to you. I've been following NDP, supporting NDP for the past few elections, but I don't think you should be so negative. I think we should give Van der Zam a chance. He's the first good thing that we've had since Mr. Bennett, and Mr. Bennett really buggered up our province. I think Van der Zam's doing an okay job. He's got the BCGEU rolling. He's looking into the forest industry, trying to get them back to work. I think we should give this guy a chance instead of sitting down, knocking him down here. Thank you.
Certainly, we're prepared to see what he has to do in this province. Look, we're willing to give him a chance. He could call a session of the legislature, bring in his program, pass it into law, and then we'd have an idea what he's planning to do before an election campaign instead of making kind of wild promises without really delivering anything of substance. So we're prepared to give Mr. Van der Zam a chance, but we want to see exactly what it is he plans to do.
Am I right in thinking there's no need for a session of the legislature, clinically speaking, until next spring?
The budget's been passed. There is no need for a legislative session till next spring.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, I have a question about your job creation program. I have just finished investing $10,000 in my education, going into debt.
Right.
I've graduated to find myself unemployed. And I was wondering, what can you do specifically for people like us who've now graduated from post-secondary education?
Well, an excellent question. First of all, you indicate that you're $10,000 in debt, and I should point out that when the New Democratic Party was in government, we set up a student grant program that would reduce the cost to you of your post-secondary education, and so that you wouldn't be leaving school with such a heavy debt. In addition, we've put forward the Youth Guarantee Program, which we estimate will put to work something like 22,000 people, either on a job, in school, or in a training program, or some combination of the three. So we have an excellent program that's being put together. And in fact, that program is now being adopted by Margaret Thatcher in Britain.
But would that Youth Guarantee Program only pay minimum wage, like $3.65 an hour?
No, as I indicated, the NDP is not in favor of the current minimum wage. It's far too low. It's an inducement to go on welfare rather than to go to work. We would raise that minimum wage in stages so that people who work could work above the poverty line with a dignified wage level.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead from, said he putting on his glasses, Nanaimo. LD2? There we are.
From Nanaimo.
Right.
Mr. Skelly, I am in
afternoon.
your riding.
In Alberni.
I live in your riding. You are not in favor. Nanaimo.
Come on.
That's Dave Stupich's writing, but fire away.
Okay. Mr. Skelly, you are not in favor of the minimum wage. Well, we're in your riding, whatever.
Well, he's not against the minimum wage. He says it's not high enough. I don't know what your point is at all, caller. I must give you 2 seconds
Just
to
a
make
minute,
sense.
Jack. Just a minute, Jack.
Yes, make sense.
I'll make sense.
Come on, then.
Mr. Skelly,
Yes, go ahead.
you intend to create X number of jobs. What kind of money are you going to pay those people?
Well, first of all, it's pointless to create jobs if you're going to pay people at the current minimum wage, which is $3.65 an hour. They simply cannot survive on that minimum wage. And in fact, it means that welfare is making them a better offer. What we have to do in this province is to raise the minimum wage, because we have the lowest minimum wage in Canada, so that people who do work can support their families and can live in dignity. So we intend to raise that minimum wage. Now, we did it 3 times when we were in government before. Everybody protested. They said it would decrease the number of jobs. They said it would shut businesses down. But in fact, when people have disposable income in their pockets, business thrives and the number of jobs increase.
But those were good days. There was prosperity in British Columbia at that particular time, and we don't have that state of affairs now.
Today, there's
Mr.
prosperity.
Skelly.
There's prosperity in Manitoba, because Manitoba has a program of getting people back to work. They have one of the lowest unemployment levels in Canada, and they have one of the highest minimum wage levels.
Go ahead from Kelowna.
Jack, it's wonderful to see you back or hear you back on television. Mr. Skelly, you have been in the opposition seat since 1984, and you always say you have solutions to everything. Why haven't you presented some of your marvelous solutions as a private bill?
He has done, I'm
Well,
sure.
I'm glad you asked the question. We presented the Jobs First Employment Strategy as a private member's bill last fall. We presented the Youth Guarantee as a private member's bill this spring. A number of my colleagues have also presented private members' bills in a number of areas, including human rights, employment of women, equal access for women to the employment and education system. So there's a whole series of private members' bills that we've presented. Get in touch with my office in Victoria, and we'll make sure you get copies of them.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was wondering, Bob, what are you going to do about the ALRT crossing, that it's only $100,000 different for a non-union to a $28 million job?
We've suggested that the ALRT crossing at New Westminster be retendered on a fair wage basis. Yes, the non-union Hyundai consortium has bid below the nearest union employer, but a large percentage of the work that consortium plans to do will be done in Korea rather than in British Columbia. And we're saying that there's much greater benefit to the provincial economy if we do that work here in BC rather than in Korea, and put our people back to work on that project rather than people overseas.
Go ahead, please. Do you regard the Van der Zalm government as a traditionally non-union government, which is going to do all it can to hamper unions?
I think Van der Zalm is trying to sound like a New Democrat before the election, but I fully expect him to act like Bill Bennett after the election. But certainly he's trying to present a different political persona now than he will after the election.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Mr. Skelly.
Yes.
That's you. That's
Yeah?
you. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Skelly, listening to your program, it sounds to me like probably one of your big stays for the next election is going to be as Mr. Van der Zam's conflict of interest.
Go on, carry on.
What I was more or less wondering is maybe if, let's say in October, it looks like the election will be, you are going to be the next premier of British Columbia, where would your conflict of interest be? Or would you have one?
Well, I don't feel I have one, but in any case, that's not a judgment for me to make. That should be a judgment that should be made by the public. I've disclosed all of my holdings. There's very few of them, but I do have land holdings in the province. However, it should not be my judgment, as I said. We should have an independent ethics officer of the legislature. We should have a comprehensive conflict of interest statute and guidelines, and those should be brought down prior to the appointment of a cabinet.
Thank you. I'd like viewers to tell me now, to spicing it up a little bit, which man they prefer for premier, Van der Zalm or Skelly? Let's go that way. Who do you like best for premier after the break?
You're gonna ask.
I just asked Mr. Skelly if he thought it fair for me to ask callers to tell me Van der Zalm or Skelly for premier, and he said,
No, but that's life.
it's not fair, but that's life. Go ahead, please.
Hello, I have a question for Mr. Skelly. Last time, well, not last time, but when the NDP was in power, you were in Duncan at a meeting with the MLA for that area, and you made a comment that the hydroelectric power coming from dams and flooding rivers and valleys and that was polluting, and we should stop that kind of power, and we should go to the non-polluting system of nuclear power. Do you still believe that?
No, I didn't say that, and I don't believe that then, and I don't believe it now.
Well, that's because I heard it, but
No, that's absolutely wrong. The NDP is opposed to nuclear power. I took a leading role in developing the anti-nuclear policy of the NDP. You may be referring to some other politician.
Fair enough. Well, who do you want, Van der Zam or Skelly?
Skelly.
Skelly, thank you very much. Who do you want, Van der Zam or Skelly?
Are you talking to me?
Yes, ma'am.
I think we shouldn't label ourselves before we're asked a question. That's kind of unfair pool, don't you think? Anyway, I'll tell you afterwards, okay?
Whatever you say, ma'am.
Okay, I think Premier Van der Zam gives an impression that he's very sincere and forthright when he's talking about various bits and pieces. But so far, they don't add up to a clear, consistent pattern of programs, economic or otherwise. So I'd like to put this question to Mr. Kelly. Based on Premier Van der Zam's past performance, do you think Van der Zam's capable of putting together such a pattern? In other words, can a leopard change his spots? Okay, and do you think that the voters really care? Are they so mesmerized by all those teeth and charm that is what's going to win their votes? And how can the NDP counteract all that charm? And
okay, ma'am.
Okay, and I don't think I'll fall for your little trap.
Well, it's a good question, though, that I think in any politician you have to check his record or her record to find out how they performed in the past. And I think you have to use that record as a method of judging what they can do in the future. In Mr. Van der Zam's case, I think he visited chaos on every ministry he's been involved in, and I think that that's the kind of Mr. Van der Zam that we'll see after the next election.
Go ahead, please.
Hi there.
Hi there.
I'm not getting sucked in by Mr. Van der Zam's cheerfulness or his big smile. I think Bob Skelly is going to be the next Premier of British Columbia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Skelly. It's nice to hear the NDP side of the story. We've heard so much from Mr. Van der Zam since he became the leader. On the commercial earlier in the show, Mr. Van der Zam was stating that the Expo debt will not be paid by taxpayers' money, that it will be paid by the 649 funds. Now, it seems to me that government lottery is taxpayers' money. What I want to know is, when the NDP is government, and I'm assuming they will be, how you will deal with the debt of the Expo.
Well, first and foremost, Mr. Van der Zam is misleading you a little bit if he's suggesting that it won't be paid for by the taxpayers' money because you have those Lottery 649 revenues. Those revenues would have gone to other purposes: amateur sports, promotion of arts and culture, healthcare and healthcare research. But because they have to spend those lottery funds on Expo, it means that they will not be available for those useful public purposes.
You agree, though, that they'll probably be able to say that the $311 million deficit no longer exists because of the increase in lotto revenues. That was what Mr. Van der Zam indicated to me last night.
Well, we don't know exactly what the deficit is going to be, and by allocating lotto revenues to pay the deficit of Expo, it means you're depriving the public of spending those lotto revenues on something that would be useful.
We won't know the score until Expo, until it's all closed down and we get a look at the books.
I suspect we won't know until after the next election, in the same way that we won't know the costs of the ALRT system till after the next election, and we won't know the deficit for this fiscal year until after the next election.
But he told me that there was going to be enough extra usage of the ALRT system to enable them to take off the transit levy for this year at least.
Well, he made that promise, but who knows?
Go ahead, please. Hello.
Hello, Jack.
Yes, you, ma'am.
Yes. Mr. Skelly.
Go ahead.
I listened to Mr. Van der Zam, or Premier Van der Zam, last night.
Yes.
And I'm listening to you this evening. And believe me, with your negative attitude, I would not vote for you. Mr. Van der Zam came on there last night, and he gave us a feeling that there was hope in this province, not dull, like you're putting through to us tonight. And believe me, you were in there a few years ago, and your party did nothing. Okay, goodbye.
Well, let me tell you, our party created 55,000 jobs a year for 2 years when the economy was 1/4 the size that it is now. In the worst year of the NDP government during the 75 recession, we created 23,000 new jobs, better than the performance of this government in any single year since 1981. So I think we did quite a bit in this province.
You're used, of course, to being snubbed or praised or whatever. It's part of your job.
Oh, I think so. When you put yourself up in the public arena, there's people who support you and people who don't.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Skelly? I have two major concerns. When we, the people of the province of British Columbia, took a flyer on the NDP in the Barrett era, the pork barrel almost broke this province after a 30-month period. You appear to be following the same policy. How do you expect to go about correcting this if and when you are elected?
Well, first of all, in the NDP government between 72 and 75, we declared a surplus in each and every year that we were in government, in addition to the job creation effort I described that hasn't been equaled since by the social credit governments. The only deficits that have been run in the last 10 or 15 years have been run by the Bill Bennett government.
You mentioned pork barrel, but the only pork barrel I think you could be accused of would be in leading things towards the unions, with your Fair Wages Act, or your union conditions.
I don't think that's true. I think we ran a fairly efficient government. We got a lot of things done. We built new ferries. We developed the Agricultural Land Reserve. We developed the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia.
Now, if you hadn't developed the Agricultural Land Reserve, there wouldn't have been all this fuss about fantasy, what's its name?
We increased pensions for senior citizens, for people on workers' compensation.
You brought in income hastily and had to amend the thing from day to day to get it back in order.
Well,
but that wasn't you, that was Barrett.
Any good government looks at legislation and amends it where it's required. Certainly.
Second looks are endemic in this province. Go ahead, please.
Yes, if the BC GEU does not accept the contract, how will that affect a Van der Zalm election?
You mean the ballot has not yet been declared on the BC
Well, it
GEU?
hasn't. And there's a lot of us that are not very happy.
I believe it's subject to ratification, but rather than speculating on whether they will or they won't, I think we better wait and see what happens with the ratification votes.
Thank you. Go ahead from Victoria, please.
Yes, hello. I've only recently moved from Alberta, so I'm just getting used to this new political structure with all these new faces. I find on several occasions, Mr. Skelly, you have indicated that after the next election, Mr. Van der Zalm will probably operate in the same manner as Bennett. You're almost concluding that he may or may not win. I don't know. Tell me, there is a reality here that both of you seem to be ignoring, and the reality is that Van der Zalm is going to be tough to beat if he calls an election the next month. How do you plan to deal with this? I know this is probably been asked a couple of times. I've just tuned in, but it's a cold...
Very briefly.
Okay, good question. Mr. Van der Zalm has been up against the NDP before. In 1968, he was beaten by Barry Mather. In 1984, he was beaten by Mike Harcourt. In 1983, he resigned in the face of a defeat by Ernie Hall. I think his next defeat is coming up shortly.
I'll be back after the break. A special message to Milano Pizza in Burnaby. We used his number instead of our number last night, nearly drove the poor man crazy. His number is 420-3333, Milano Pizza. Tomorrow, back with the heavy stuff after my summer break at the new time of 5 p.m., my guest will be the man in the middle of the IWA crisis and crunch, Jack Monroe. And we shall be discussing the problems that British Columbia, as well as the union and FIR, face in this critical strike in our industry. Tomorrow, 5 p.m. precisely.
printout showing exactly what my car really needed.
You get it only where you see this sign. Goodyear Certified Auto Service. We don't guess around.
There may be a special reason beer drinkers can expect a price cut. There may be an election very soon. Expo jobs vacated by students draw thousands and demonstrate the size of the problem of unemployment. In Newfoundland, police arrest illegal strikers as the battle continues between the government and its striking workers. From the British Columbia Television Pavilion and Expo, the News Hour with Tony Park.
Good evening. After years of